London, 1940. The city burned nightly under German bombs, yet one narrow street in Westminster remained eerily untouched. Amid the blackened ruins, a modest townhouse at 12 Queen's Gate stood silent, its curtains always drawn, its front steps swept clean every morning as if war itself refused to touch it. Neighbors whispered it might be a government refuge, or perhaps a secret air raid shelter. In truth, the house concealed something far more vital, and far more secret, than anyone could imagine. Beneath its floors lay Station Sentinel, an underground MI6 communication hub built to serve as the nerve center of Britain's most guarded intelligence network. The war had driven British intelligence deeper underground, literally. With London's command centers threatened by nightly Luftwaffe raids, MI6 needed a hidden, bomb-resistant relay point for coded messages flowing between Bletchley Park, naval stations, and the Prime Minister's war cabinet. The townhouse, outwardly indistinguishable from its neighbors, was chosen for one reason. Its cellar connected to a disused section of the old Metropolitan Railway tunnels. Over 6 weeks in late 1940, Royal Engineers quietly reinforced the underground chamber with steel plating and soundproof walls. The result was a room no larger than a church crypt, lined with humming radios, typewriters, and encryption devices. The air smelled of dust, tobacco, and machine oil. Above ground, only a single brass plaque hinted at its existence, property of the Crown. Inside Station Sentinel worked a handful of Britain's most trusted radio officers and cipher specialists. Among them was Captain Arthur Miles, a veteran of naval intelligence, Sergeant Elsie Fenton, one of the few female code clerks seconded from Bletchley, and Lieutenant Thomas Lorne, an American liaison from the Office of Naval Intelligence, newly arrived under the Lend-Lease cooperation. They worked in shifts that blurred day and night, decoding intercepted German U-boat transmissions and forwarding them to Bletchley's Hut 8 for analysis. To them, this hidden basement was both sanctuary and prison. As Fenton later wrote in her diary, "We live in silence. Even the bombs above seem distant, as if we're ghosts below the earth, sending messages no one must ever know came from us." The struggle inside Station Sentinel was not just technical, it was psychological. Their work demanded absolute secrecy. No one outside the team knew their names, not even most of MI6. They were forbidden to discuss operations with family or other branches. The pressure to remain invisible wore at their nerves. Miles, once calm and measured, began to pace during shifts, muttering code sequences aloud. The flickering lamps and endless static bred tension. A single misrouted signal could cost convoys their lives in the Atlantic. The stakes were measured in ships lost and sailors drowned. In 1 week of November 1940, 6 British merchant vessels were sunk, all within days of a failed intercept. The guilt weighed heavy on the small crew. The technical challenge was immense. They relied on bulky Marconi Type 405 transmitters and the new Type X cipher machines, often plagued by power surges from nearby bomb damage. The cryptographers had to balance the speed of relay against the need for total encryption. A delay of even minutes could render intercepted data useless. Every night, as Luftwaffe bombers droned overhead, the operators continued tapping messages to Bletchley, fragments of Enigma-encoded chatter captured by coastal listening posts. They were the unseen link in the chain that eventually helped break Hitler's naval code. Yet the real mystery of Station Sentinel began quietly. In late November, a visiting civil defense inspector reportedly heard voices beneath the house after midnight, though no one on duty admitted to speaking. Days later, 2 technicians from the Post Office Signals Corps, who had been calibrating the radio aerial on the roof, failed to report for their next shift. Their personal effects remained untouched in the dormitory upstairs. MI6 headquarters issued no inquiry. The official ledger simply noted, "Personnel transferred." Fenton's diary entry from that day reads, "Something isn't right. We are told not to ask questions. That's the rule." But the silence feels heavier now. To those few who later learned of Station Sentinel, the secrecy surrounding the disappearance became the first crack in its legend. Some historians would later speculate the men were caught attempting to duplicate transmissions or had overheard something they shouldn't have, perhaps a signal not meant for British ears at all. Whatever the truth, the files were sealed, And even decades later, the incident remained classified under the Official Secrets Act. A note found in Captain Miles's private papers after the war, written in his careful script, simply read, "The less one knows of Sentinel, the longer one sleeps at night." It captures the essence of a time when Britain's survival depended not only on courage but on silence, the silence of men and women working beneath the earth, unseen and unremembered. As the year closed and the Blitz raged on, London citizens continued walking past the quiet townhouse, unaware that just beneath their feet, a handful of operators were intercepting messages that could turn the tide of war. But for those inside, the question lingered: if even their own people could vanish without explanation, who exactly was Station Sentinel serving? By early 1941, Station Sentinel had become one of the most secretive nodes in Britain's wartime intelligence web. From the outside, the townhouse on Queen's Gate remained nondescript, its windows blacked out, its doorway unmarked. But below, deep under London's streets, the hum of generators and the clatter of Typex cipher machines continued without pause. The team worked in rotating shifts, intercepting and decoding German naval transmissions that could spell life or death for Allied convoys in the Atlantic. Every message mattered, every number group, every call sign, and errors were not tolerated. The isolation was suffocating. For many of the staff, the outside world had shrunk to a concrete chamber and the dull glow of radio dials. Days were measured in intercepted frequencies rather than hours. Lieutenant Thomas Lorne, the American liaison, had arrived from Washington with a clean uniform and unshakable optimism. But after 3 months underground, his letters home became curt, almost coded. "The air is thin down here," he wrote to a friend. "I've begun to dream in Morse." The team's mission was brutally clear: track and jam U-boat coordination signals that guided Wolf-Pack attacks on Allied shipping. The Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its most desperate phase. German Admiral Karl Donitz had refined his tactics, using encrypted shortwave bursts to direct submarines against unescorted convoys. If Sentinel failed to intercept those transmissions in time, entire fleets could vanish beneath the waves. One entry in Fenton's daily log captures the weight of their work. Each error carries the sound of sinking metal. "We listen for ghosts in the static." Yet despite their discipline, something began to unravel. In December 1941, barely 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor brought America formally into the war, the tension inside the base grew unbearable. The team had recently begun collaborating with a second, smaller American contingent operating out of Grosvenor Square, the embryo of what would soon become the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. Though both sides were technically allies, mistrust ran deep. British officers accused the Americans of withholding cipher keys. The Americans, in turn, suspected MI6 of feeding them doctored intercepts. The paranoia came to a head when 2 British operators failed to report for duty one morning. At first, their absence was dismissed as exhaustion. Long shifts and rationed food had worn everyone thin. But when a search was finally ordered, their bunks were untouched, and their codebooks were gone. No one had seen them leave, and there was no sign of forced entry. Only a half-finished cup of tea sat beside a still-warm transmitter. MI6 dispatched an internal security officer, a quiet, methodical man named Commander Richard Hale, to investigate. Hale's presence alone chilled the mood. He asked no direct questions but seemed to already know the answers. Within days, several of the staff were quietly reassigned, including the most junior code clerk. The Americans were ordered to suspend joint transmissions until further notice. In one of the few surviving memos from that period, Hale wrote, "Operational integrity maintained. No external breach detected. Recommend continued observation." But the unease didn't fade. Lorne noticed that new messages arriving from Bletchley contained subtle inconsistencies, words misspelled, phrases out of pattern, sometimes an entire string of gibberish that didn't fit any known cipher group. When he asked about it, his British counterpart, Captain Miles, only said, "You're seeing too much, Lieutenant. Leave the analysis to us." It was the first time Lorne began to suspect the threat might not be from outside at all. In late December, a coded signal arrived marked, "Urgent. Operation Nightfall." The instructions ordered Sentinel to reroute all Atlantic intercepts through a secondary frequency for security verification. The shift was carried out immediately, but it had a strange side effect. For nearly 24 hours, Sentinel received no German transmissions at all. Total silence. To a trained operator, that was impossible. The Kriegsmarine never stopped talking. Then, just as suddenly, the signals resumed, stronger, clearer, but subtly different. Fenton later recalled that night as the moment the air itself seemed to turn against them. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and we were listening to an echo of ourselves, she wrote. Within days, convoy HX-219 was ambushed mid-Atlantic, a route Sentinel had supposedly secured. 20 ships were sunk. The timing was exact. Someone, somewhere, was feeding information to the enemy. The official inquiry concluded that the Germans had improved their encryption. But among the surviving crew, that explanation never sat right. The missing men, the doctored messages, the brief but total blackout, it all hinted at a deeper breach. One the authorities preferred to keep buried beneath the streets of Westminster. A final entry in Captain Miles's coded notebook, dated January 2, 1942, reads simply, 2 gone. 1 compromised. We are being watched from within. The blackout had ended, but for Station Sentinel, the silence was only beginning. By early 1942, the small crew beneath Queen's Gate was living on borrowed time and trust. Station Sentinel, once a model of British precision, had become a nest of paranoia and quiet accusation. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, static, and unspoken fear. The 2 vanished operators were never found, yet their absence lingered in every corner of the room. Each creak of the floorboards, each delayed transmission, made the team flinch. And now, as Allied intelligence deepened its cooperation with the Americans, the walls of secrecy began to close in from both sides. Captain Arthur Miles had spent 20 years in naval intelligence. He had survived the North Sea patrols of the First World War, and yet the tension at Sentinel was different, more corrosive. "This is not war as I knew it," he confided to his journal. "This is something colder. The enemy is invisible, and we're told not to look for him." After the December disappearances, MI6 quietly restricted access to the underground complex. No one entered or left without written authorization from Commander Richard Hale. Even deliveries of fuel and food were rerouted through secondary tunnels beneath Westminster. Meanwhile, across town, the Americans were asking questions. The newly formed OSS had taken notice of the blackout incident and the convoy losses that followed. A liaison officer from Grosvenor Square, Major Henry Calvert, arrived at Station Sentinel one morning unannounced, carrying a leather folder stamped, "Confidential, US/UK Joint OPS." He demanded to review the original intercept logs from December. Miles refused, citing Crown Security Classification. What began as professional disagreement escalated into confrontation. "We're supposed to be fighting the same war," Calvert snapped. "But every time we share information, it disappears into your damned fog." In the weeks that followed, joint operations froze. British and American code teams began running parallel intercepts, each believing the other was compromised. The tension nearly derailed the early stages of Operation Ironclad, a joint code-sharing initiative meant to coordinate Atlantic interception patterns. The irony was bitter. Both sides needed each other to survive, yet neither could trust the other to tell the truth. On January 20th, the tension reached breaking point. A courier from MI6's Central Registry delivered an unmarked envelope addressed only to Station Commander. Inside was a single typewritten message: "Cease transmission on Channel 4B. Suspected leak. Await further instruction." The order bore no official signature, but it carried a valid clearance stamp. Miles, following protocol, halted all outbound traffic. For nearly 48 hours, the radios in the chamber went silent. Then, unexpectedly, the Americans reported receiving coded bursts on 4B messages that appeared to originate from Sentinel itself. Major Calvert returned, furious, accusing Miles of playing double. "We traced the signal to your sector," he said, slamming the table. "Someone down here is talking, and not to London." Miles denied it, but even his own staff had begun to question him. The equipment showed no sign of use. The transmitters were powered down. And yet the message logs confirmed activity that none of the team had authorized. Commander Hale reappeared that evening, calm as ever. He dismissed the American claims, ordered the matter classified, and instructed the crew to resume normal operations. His reasoning was simple: the less noise we make, the fewer ears will listen. But that night, Elsie Fenton awoke in the dormitory to hear footsteps in the tunnel outside. Slow, deliberate, echoing against the concrete. When she checked the duty roster, no one had been assigned to the night watch. By February, the station's personnel roster had changed entirely. Several operators were quietly reassigned to Bletchley Park, others vanished into unnamed field duties. The Americans, too, withdrew their liaisons, leaving behind only one, Lieutenant Lorne, who refused to abandon his post. He continued to work side by side with Fenton, the two of them sharing the silent dread of knowing something was terribly wrong. In one of her letters, smuggled through diplomatic mail, Fenton wrote, "They tell us the war is being won above ground, but here below, it feels like we are losing to shadows." It was around this time that a fragmentary report surfaced at MI6 headquarters, later declassified in 1987. It referred to a breach of operational control in the London Signal Division, and recommended the termination of cooperative channels pending review. The document was signed, cryptically, C. Division, Internal Oversight. Beneath that, a single handwritten note read, "Ironclad suspended indefinitely." To historians, that file became one of the great mysteries of Allied intelligence cooperation. Why a program meant to strengthen transatlantic coordination was shut down just as the tide of war began to turn. The truth, hidden under layers of redacted pages, likely died with those who worked beneath Queen's Gate. Before the end of February, Captain Miles was transferred for medical rest, and never returned to service. No obituary, no citation. His post was filled by another officer whose name appears nowhere in official records. The remaining staff were told only this: Station Sentinel will continue under revised parameters. In her final diary entry before reassignment, Fenton summed up what the surviving crew all felt. "We came here to stop the enemy from listening. Somewhere along the line, we became the ones being listened to." The doors of Station Sentinel stayed locked for months, its purpose shifting into something darker, more covert, a place not just for listening to the enemy, but for shaping the very lies the enemy would hear next. By mid-1943, the war in Europe had reached a turning point. The Allies were preparing for a massive counterstrike, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. But before D-Day could be launched, Britain needed to deceive the German High Command completely about when and where that strike would occur. Beneath the quiet townhouse at 12 Queen's Gate, Station Sentinel, once a listening post, was reactivated for an entirely new purpose. It was no longer about intercepting enemy signals. Now it was about sending them. The operation was known only to a handful of senior officers under the codename Bodyguard. Its goal: to mislead Hitler into believing the invasion would strike at Calais instead of Normandy. Sentinel became a key node in this vast web of deception, transmitting false intelligence via carefully crafted German-language broadcasts. These signals, supposedly from double agents in occupied Europe, would be intercepted by the enemy and used to reinforce their own false confidence. MI6 called it feeding the mirror. Inside the underground chamber, the equipment was upgraded: new Type X Mark III machines, faster teleprinters, and soundproofed antenna relays. The personnel roster had changed entirely. Only one of the original crew remained, Lieutenant Thomas Lorne, the American liaison who refused to leave after the 1942 purge. He had been cleared to continue, under direct supervision from MI6's counterintelligence section. "They say I'm here to coordinate transmissions," he wrote in a coded letter to Washington. "But I think I'm here to make sure no one else asks where the signals are really coming from." 4 weeks, Sentinel hummed with controlled deceit. Operators fabricated reports of phantom divisions, imaginary fuel depots, and fake troop convoys. German intelligence, reading what they thought were intercepted Allied transmissions, began diverting resources northward. By May 1944, the ruse was working, so effectively that the real invasion plans remained completely hidden. Still, those inside Sentinel couldn't escape a growing sense that they had crossed a moral line. "We weren't sure who we were lying to, the Germans or ourselves," Lorne later said in an interview years after the war. "Once you start building an illusion that large, you start believing parts of it." But then, the deception began to turn on itself. On June 2nd, just 4 days before the Normandy landings, Station Sentinel abruptly went dark. All communications ceased. The transmitters powered down without warning. At first, it was believed to be a power fault caused by nearby bomb damage. But when engineers descended into the tunnels, they found the systems perfectly intact, as if someone had shut them down deliberately. When the base came back online 3 days later, something had changed. Transmissions were flowing again, but to the wrong coordinates. A small discrepancy, barely a frequency off, was enough to redirect some of the false data toward British channels rather than the enemy's. It caused temporary confusion at Whitehall and a furious response from the War Office. "It was like hearing your own echo in a tunnel," one analyst recalled. The blackout had not only jeopardized secrecy, it had nearly compromised Operation Overlord itself. MI6 ordered an immediate internal audit. Commander Richard Hale, still the shadow overseeing Sentinel, reported that no sabotage was evident. But a sealed memo found decades later paints a different picture. It mentions interference by internal asset, purpose unclear, results contained. The identity of that asset remains classified to this day. What is known is that Lieutenant Lorne was questioned for 72 hours straight, then abruptly reassigned to a temporary foreign posting, and never returned to London. His personal effects, a fountain pen, a wristwatch, and a single reel of magnetic tape, were left behind, logged but never claimed. The tape, discovered in 1972 during a renovation, was labeled S413, mirror line test. When played, it contained only static for the first 2 minutes, then faint Morse signals. Analysts later translated them as fragments of a repeated phrase, "We hear ourselves too clearly." Whether this was part of the deception operation or something else entirely, no one has ever determined. After D-Day, the success of the Allied deception was undeniable. The Germans held their forces at Calais for weeks, allowing the Normandy invasion to succeed. Yet, within MI6, the mood was not celebratory. Sentinel had done its duty, but it had become something else, a ghost network, haunted by missing personnel, unexplained transmissions, and orders signed by no one. As one surviving engineer later said, "When we shut the lights that summer, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like burying a secret." By August 1944, Station Sentinel was sealed again. The team dispersed, the files marked closed, Directive 9. No one spoke of the blackout or the tape again. But for those few who had worked in its shadow, the question never left. Was Sentinel merely a tool of deception, or had it become one of its own illusions, a lie so deep even its masters no longer knew where the truth began? Above ground, the townhouse remained pristine, its curtains still drawn. The neighbors once again believed it was empty. Yet beneath its floors, in the silent tunnels of Westminster, the machines of Station Sentinel waited, perfectly preserved, ready for a signal that would never come. Victory came to Europe in May 1945, and the world erupted in celebration. But at 12 Queen's Gate, the end of the war arrived not with cheers, but with silence. On the morning of VE Day, an MI6 officer named Commander Hale descended one final time into the tunnels beneath the townhouse. He ordered the remaining staff to power down the transmitters, burn all cipher pads, and seal the communication vault. "The war is over," he said, "but this place was never meant to exist." Hours later, the entrance was welded shut, the equipment left entombed in darkness. Officially, Station Sentinel was decommissioned. In reality, it vanished from record. The names of its operators disappeared from payroll lists. The property itself was transferred to a private trust, for use by the Ministry of Works. When the National Archives released its post-war intelligence summaries, there was no mention of Sentinel, no trace of the London Safehouse or its operations. Even among MI6 veterans, few admitted to knowing of it. It was as if the base had been erased from history, or deliberately buried. Yet the story didn't end there. In 1947, civil engineers working on a new power conduit beneath Westminster reported finding sealed metal doors deep below the street, covered in ash and soot. Inside, they discovered rooms lined with rusting equipment and cables snaking into the walls, remnants of what appeared to be an underground radio facility. Before any detailed inspection could be made, military police arrived and ordered the site sealed again. The official reason: hazardous conditions. The engineers were told to forget what they'd seen. One of them later recalled, "It was as if we'd stepped into a time capsule, or a secret someone still didn't want found." For more than a decade, the townhouse above remained boarded up. Neighbors claimed it was being used as a document storage facility. But every few months, a black car would pull up, and two men in plain suits would enter for an hour, then leave without speaking to anyone. The locals began calling it the Silent House. The post-war years turned its legend into rumor: an MI6 bunker, a wartime code room, a prison for defectors. No one really knew. Then, in 1957, a curious reference appeared in a newly declassified Treasury memo. It mentioned a redundant communication asset, Westminster sector, scheduled for disposal. No other document clarified what that phrase meant, but those familiar with wartime codenames recognized it instantly. Sentinel. Someone within the bureaucracy had slipped, acknowledging a facility that supposedly never existed. Yet instead of being dismantled, the site remained untouched. The Ministry of Works deferred its demolition, pending review. To this day, no review has ever been filed. What became of the final transmissions sent from Station Sentinel remains a subject of speculation. Radio historians claim that, in the closing days of April 1945, a series of encoded signals were broadcast from an unregistered London frequency, short bursts of Morse that repeated a phrase every hour: "Silent run complete." The origin was triangulated to somewhere beneath Westminster, but no agency claimed responsibility. Some say it was a final sign-off, the operator's way of confirming their mission's end. Others suspect it was something else, a signal meant for an audience no one has ever identified. In the years that followed, fragments of Station Sentinel resurfaced in odd places. A coded reference in a 1963 MI6 training manual. A rusted equipment manifest found during renovations of Whitehall basements. Even a requisition order for replacement radio valves, dated 1952, long after the base was supposedly shut down. Each clue raised the same question: had Sentinel really gone dark, or had it simply changed hands? One of the most telling artifacts was discovered in 1968 during a renovation of a nearby government records office. An unmarked metal box containing a half-melted cipher wheel and a notebook filled with strange handwritten tables. On the last page, in faded ink, someone had written, "We transmit truth until truth transmits us." The handwriting matched that of Lieutenant Thomas Lorne, the American liaison who disappeared in 1944. How his notes resurfaced in Westminster 2 decades later remains unexplained. By the late 1950s, the legend of the hidden MI6 base had begun circulating in intelligence circles. Some dismissed it as Cold War gossip, a convenient myth to explain missing wartime files. Others whispered that Sentinel had been reactivated, not as a listening post, but as a testing ground for post-war signal interception, perhaps even early Cold War espionage. The truth was locked away, sealed under layers of classification and concrete. To the public, the townhouse eventually returned to civilian use. Its windows were unshuttered, its facade restored. A government lease listed it as administrative property, non-residential. But the locals still swore that, late at night, the faint hum of machinery could be heard from beneath the pavement. One elderly resident told a journalist in 1961, "They say the war ended. But on this street, it never quite stopped." Even now, no definitive record explains who ordered Sentinel's closure or what was sent in its final transmission. All that remains are fragments, diary pages, sealed reports, and that single haunting phrase still unsolved, "Silent run complete." Whatever it meant, it marked the end of something. Or perhaps, the beginning of something that has never truly stopped. In the mid-1990s, long after the Cold War had cooled and Britain had begun digitizing its wartime archives, a junior historian at the Public Record Office stumbled upon an unlisted file. It was thin, only 8 pages, and bore no title, just a handwritten label, Project Sentinel Closure. The historian, assuming it was a clerical note about post-war property sales, opened it casually. Inside were 3 typed memoranda, a brief inventory of removed materials, and a single cryptic line typed in faded ink at the bottom of the final page. Archive relocated. Access restricted indefinitely. The discovery reignited an old rumor in intelligence circles, that MI6 had once maintained a hidden base beneath Westminster, sealed since 1945. Journalists soon came calling, but officials offered no comment. When pressed, the Ministry of Defense released a bland statement: "No record of a facility by that name exists." Yet within weeks, anonymous sources began feeding details to the press. Sealed tunnels under Queen's Gate, unmarked files transferred to the GCHQ archives in Cheltenham, even a reference to an active code network still monitored for training. The legend of Station Sentinel was alive again. A small BBC documentary team obtained permission to film inside the Queen's Gate townhouse, now renovated into government offices. The crew expected a dull segment on wartime urban defenses. But in the basement, behind a false wall, they found what appeared to be a bricked-over steel hatch. The discovery footage aired once, briefly, before being pulled for security review. The producer later said quietly, "We were told that whatever was down there wasn't part of history yet." The footage has never reappeared. Historians who followed the trail found subtle fingerprints scattered across post-war intelligence programs. A 1958 memorandum from GCHQ referred to legacy algorithms retained from Sentinel transmission patterns. A 1969 MI6 brief mentioned mirror signal studies, London sector. Even the newly declassified Venona project, which decrypted Soviet communications, showed signs of borrowing Sentinel's frequency protocols. The base may have been buried, but its methods endured. One former cryptographer put it succinctly: "We built a ghost that kept working after we stopped listening." As interest grew, so did resistance. Requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act were refused, citing national security implications. In 2002, when researchers sought access to the Queen's Gate foundations for structural mapping, they were abruptly denied on the grounds of public safety. Officially, there were fears of instability in the old tunnels. Unofficially, it was clear the government still wanted whatever was below to remain untouched. By the 2010s, the name Station Sentinel had passed into quiet folklore, a symbol of Britain's hidden war and the moral cost of secrecy. Yet one lingering mystery remained: a set of unaccounted-for transmissions logged by amateur radio enthusiasts in 1994. They reported shortwave bursts on a disused wartime frequency, matching the old Sentinel pattern. 4 seconds of static, 3 dots, 2 dashes. The message repeated every hour for 3 nights, then vanished. The origin was triangulated to central London. No agency claimed responsibility. Today, the townhouse stands fully restored, home to an ordinary-looking legal office. Tourists walk past unaware that, beneath their feet, an underground world of wartime deception and silence still lies sealed behind concrete. But among those who know its story, the researchers, the veterans, the few surviving families of the operators, there remains an uneasy belief that Sentinel was never entirely shut down. As one retired GCHQ analyst told a reporter in 1997, "Networks don't die. They go quiet." And so the legend endures, that beneath a quiet London street, a forgotten base still waits, its machines cold, its purpose unknown, its last transmission looping endlessly somewhere in the ether. A final whisper from the hidden war. Silent run complete.